Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of 10-Minute Theology. We've been talking about angels. Boy, specifically, we've been talking about the Nephilim. We're going to hit it again, part 15 this time for the Angels series, focusing on are there giants in the Bible? Last time we talked about the Nephilim, where we believe they came from, some alternate theories as well. This time we're going to talk about giants in the Bible, and were the Nephilim really giants? And can we trace them back to a giant race of people? Let's go ahead and jump in and see what we have for you this time. Interesting stuff, fascinating as we dive into the text. We'll be doing some word studies as well to really dig into the text to show you what we have. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we have this time. What are the Nephilim? As we talked about last time, not going to review all that again. Go back and watch last week's episode if you want to see more on that again. But specifically with the Nephilim, were they really giants? And we need to look at the word for Nephilim, which we did not do last time, surprisingly, but we'll take a look this time. So the Hebrew word for Nephilim, the root meaning is most likely from the Hebrew root nephal, meaning to fall, which is where we get the fallen ones. So Nephilim you could really translate to the fallen ones, which is pretty interesting. Now, if we look at the Septuagint, and if you remember, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that they had in New Testament times. So the majority of the Old Testament quotes in your New Testament are actually from the Greek in the Septuagint, as opposed to from the Hebrew text itself. And that was because, just like how we have different translations today, depending on the different languages that you speak, when you look at this back then, in the 2nd and 3rd century BC, the Hebrew as a language was starting to fade out and was being spoken as the common language, being replaced by Greek. As a result, they needed a translation in their language that they spoke day to day. So that's where the Septuagint came from, supposedly translated in Alexandria, Egypt. Also abbreviated the LXX, which is short for 70. And if you think of the Roman numeral 70, LXX, and that just comes from the lore of they believe there could have been 70 translators who did this. Unsubstantiated, but just a little background on that. So if we look at that, now this is interesting because look at the word here in the Septuagint. The Greek word for nephal used here for the fallen ones is gigantes. So you see they're transliterated in the English. You also see it in the Greek, gigantes. Boy, if we transliterate that, we get giant, don't we? As opposed to translate it, where we would get fallen one. But classical Greek uses the word usually as earthborn in those classical translations. Interesting, it translates that. If we transliterate it, though, we get the word giant. So context is always very important. So we have these two words. We have the Hebrew word and the Greek word. And now, since we don't exactly have a good meaning for what they were, we have to use the context of the different passages of Scripture to determine what can we make that root meaning. Okay, what's the most logical representation of it? So were they really giants? And again, we looked at Numbers 13 last time. Want to take another peek this time? We'll look at one part of it here, and you see the underlined part. And this really emphasized that when they went into the land, that the men who they saw were men of great size. You see they're underlined. Also in the end of verse 33 there, they even emphasized it again, saying, hey, we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight, i.e. like grasshoppers to them as well. You get to Deuteronomy 3, which we also hit last time, but I want to just put it up here again for emphasis because it talks about Og, who was the king of Bashan. You remember Bashan was an area that was known for demonic activity, fallen activity, things like that. And it emphasized that the Og, the king of Bashan, he had a huge bed. That it was, and remember we did the conversion, around 14 feet long, also around 9 feet wide. So they're emphasizing the fact that he had a really big bed. Now, take those two things, go back up to Numbers 13, and we see that the Anak are part of the Nephilim. The Anak, or the Anakim, are part of the Nephilim. Go down there and you look in Deuteronomy 3 again, and we see of Og, the king of Bashan, that he was the only one left of the remnant of the Rephaim. So here we see that the Anakim are part of the Nephilim, and then we have a big person also in the king of Og compared to the Rephaim. So some different names that appear to be used that could be different tribes of Nephilim, hard to say. But as we look here, and we'll get some more names for the Nephilim as well. So as we look at Deuteronomy 2, and just a quick snippet of that, it's also regarded as the land of the Rephaim. The Rephaim formerly lived in it, but the Amorites called them the Zamzummim. So now we see that the Zamzummim are also compared back to the Rephaim because, in fact, the Ammonites called them the Rephaim, okay? Go to Deuteronomy 2, 10, and 11, and now we are introduced to a group called the Emim. The Emim lived there formerly, a people of great, numerous, and as tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they also regarded as Rephaim, but the Moabites called them the Emim. So we have now the Emim being referred to the Rephaim, which are like the Anakim. And notice that they were as tall as the Anakim as well. So again, the emphasis on the great size of these different people. So to summarize it here, as we look at different types, we have the Zamzummim, which are compared to the Emim-like, which are compared to the Rephaim, which are traced back to the Anakim, which we see are equated to the Nephilim. So in reality, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Zamzummim, and the Emim all appear to be different tribes of Nephilim. So pretty interesting when you start to break it down and dig into the text like this. You can find it linking to all different places, and as we see there, interesting stuff. So what about Goliath? We haven't mentioned him yet. And of course, Goliath is the most well-known giant in the Bible. Almost every kid who's been to Sunday school has heard of Goliath because the common story, even people who have not been there or even are non-churched, have usually heard the story of David and Goliath. So Goliath was a Philistine from Gath. Okay, Gath was one of the cities of the Anakim, and you can go look that up in Joshua 11, 21, 22 there. I'll put the reference for you. But thing to remember about Goliath's armor weighed around 125 pounds, and his spearhead was 15 pounds and had a shaft like that of a weaver's beam. And that's in 1 Samuel 17. You see the reference there. So clearly Goliath was a very large individual to have 125 pound armor, and the spearhead itself, just the head of the spear, was 15 pounds. Give you an idea, I know a javelin in the Olympics that they use for the javelin throw is less than 4 pounds. I forget the weight of it, but so that gives you a really good idea of how, and again, this was just the head of the spear, whereas the shaft was like that of a weaver's beam, so a very big weapon that he yielded to be able to throw and use such a thing effectively. You would have to be a large individual. Now, Goliath's height, we have different accounts, okay? Same scripture references, but different variations of it when we look at the Masoretic text. And if you remember, we've talked about Masoretic text before, but the Masoretic text is the Hebrew Old Testament, which was compiled by Hebrew scribes in the 7th to 10th centuries AD. Okay, so after Christ. So now it does link back to earlier manuscripts that are very close in age to the Septuagint, but the Masoretic text says he was 9'9". The Septuagint, which again was created in 2nd and 3rd century BC, that text says he was around 6'9", so a little less than 7 feet. So we got a little less than 10 feet, a little less than 7 feet. I don't know, they're both large people, but can we see someone who's just under 7 feet wearing 125 pound armor and being able to wield a spear that is that large and that heavy? Hard to say. It seems like the Masoretic text probably has it pretty good. Plus, do you call someone a giant that you feel like a grasshopper to them if they're not quite 7 feet tall? Depends on how tall you are, I guess. But anyway, interesting when you look at these two little differences and variations within the text. Okay, more giants in the Bible. Let's move on. The Ishbi-Benob, we read in 2 Samuel that they are among the descendants of the giant. So again, the giant. Interesting, huh? We read about an individual called Saph. Saph was among the descendants of the giant. And then we get to Goliath the Gittite, and we find that Goliath the Gittite, not to be confused with Goliath himself, but we read in 1 Chronicles actually that Goliath the Gittite was actually the brother of Goliath. So you can look that down as well. And by the way, it talks about, it compares that he had a very similar spear, a pretty similar comparison to that, and also similar armor as well when it talks about Goliath, the Gittite. And then in 2 Samuel 21, down in verse 20, we read that there was a warrior. He was a man of great stature. He had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, and had been born to the giants. So again, we read the giants are involved in this. And if you look at the word for giant there, it's the Rapha. So we take the Rapha, and boy, doesn't that get us back to the Rephaim. So consistently translated, if you look at the New American Standard, you look at the King James, you look at the ESV even, very consistently translated using the word giant on that for the translation. So interesting, there's more giants in the Bible than really that we originally thought until you start to do the study and really dive deep on it. So as we think about the Nephilim, and you go, well, wait a minute, the Nephilim were around before the flood, because it was Genesis 6 and it talked about it, right? So when the Nephilim have died in the flood, so let's look at Genesis 6:4 again, because this is a common question. And we read 6:4 and it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and keep in mind this was pre-flood in Genesis 6:4. But then it says, and also afterwards. So not only were they in the earth pre-flood time, but it says also afterwards. So after what? After the flood. Clearly, if there are giants that are being mapped back to the Nephilim that we're reading about in the Old Testament after the book of Genesis, clearly they were around afterwards as well. How did they get there? Well, if you believe that it was fallen angels who came down and procreated with human women, then they had to have done it again post-flood. So interesting when you start to tie all the story together on the different things that you find. Now, here's a little subtopic, and we're not going to spend a lot of time, but just to let you know and how this ties into other things. So, can we really tie Nephilim into Native American stories? Interesting that the Hopi, the Zuni, and some of the Plains tribes speak of star people being from the sky who came down and interacted with humans. And they're described as very tall, powerful or glowing, sometimes teaching or manipulating mankind. They had red hair. It was also rumored that they could run beside a buffalo, pick the buffalo up and kill it and consume the buffalo. So very large beings, clearly. But here's the most interesting thing to tie it back to an account of Nephilim in the Old Testament. The Native Americans speak that they had 6 fingers and 6 toes. So you hear it referred to as the 6-fingered star people that existed at the time. So part of the Native American, if you want to call it folklore, if you want to call it their stories, whatever you want to call it, I just find it fascinating that we have an encounter with beings that are considered to be some sort of supernatural creature, but yet they had 6 fingers and 6 toes too. So what does that tell you that occurred? There's also accounts, and it didn't go into it here, but you can check it out on your own. Archaeologists back in late 1800s, early 1900s, discovering very large humanoid skeletons within North America that supposedly were confiscated, taken away from them, and they've never seen them again. You can go out and Google that if you want to. Not going to spend a lot of time on it here, but interesting that there are at least some accounts of that occur in historical references in terms of finding giant type skeletons within North America. Don't know if we can give any credence or not. Unknown. We don't have any to look at today. Regardless of that, you definitely hear the stories of them. So pretty interesting. Okay. So in conclusion, what are the Nephilim? Well, we talked about what they were and where they came from, but were they giants? Well, clearly there were several different groups of giants in the Bible. There's just no doubt about it. It's very obvious from the descriptions of them, how they called them giants. At least our translation now talks about them as being giants, and just that they were very large individuals of size, both in their stature and their ability to wield large weapons. And by the way, they can all be linked back to the Nephilim. So pretty interesting. We've got all these different tribes of giants. They can all be linked back to the Nephilim. And not only that, but boy, how about those parallel stories from Native American history? Pretty interesting when you start to look at that dynamic. So that will bring us to an end of another episode of Angels. So Angels Part 15 coming to a conclusion here. Giants in the Bible. I hope you enjoyed it. It's a fascinating topic. We'll be moving on from that and probably wrap up angels next week or the week after that as we continue to look at more stuff. So regardless of that, hope you have a great week. Hope you're doing well, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody. Now, God bless.